or role model colleague. So we invited Zunes here today because he is one of the top experts in the world on international studies, Middle Eastern politics, nonviolent conflict and civil resistance, and many other things as well. His bio is too long to list here. He's currently a professor of international studies at the University of San Francisco and the program director of Middle Eastern studies there. He is also on numerous academic and professional boards related to the subject. He's called upon to do talks around the world constantly. I don't know how he keeps up his schedule. We're very lucky to have him today. His knowledge on the subject matter in his area of expertise is encyclopedic, and frankly, he's one of the smartest people that I know. So we're hoping that today his presentation is going to help you think a little bit differently about the way that the United States interacts with other countries around the world, including the Dominican Republic, the country of Oscar Wilde's family origin. So, for example, his talk today might raise the question of what motivates the United States to try and influence what happens in other countries around the world. And also, we hope that it will help you think about the fact that the United States has both supported and helped to eradicate dictators in Latin American countries as well as other regions of the world, including Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. Why did the United States support him, and then why did we decide to stop supporting him? So please don't forget to think about questions to ask Dr. Zunes at the end of the talk, and later today at his roundtable. He will be at the roundtable this afternoon at 4 o'clock. I will be there too, and I hope to see many of you. So please, let's give him a warm welcome. Last thing I should say is that he's also one of the most prolific writers that I know.
Thank you, Cynthia, for the too kind introduction, and thank you for those, not just responsible for bringing me here today, but for organizing such a special opportunity as FYE to work together with other first-year students in this common program. I'd like to start with some observations about Eastern Europe between 1945 and 1989. This is when the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics existed, when the now independent nations of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, Belarus, and others were essentially part of Russia. And the USSR, the Soviet Union, also had special relations with such Central and Eastern European countries as Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria. And while these European countries were nominally independent with their own flags and their own seats in the United Nations, the Soviets controlled their foreign policy and most of their domestic policies as well. Top government officials could only serve with the approval of the Soviets. The Soviets kept these dictatorships in power, despite their people's desires to be free, arming and training the government's dreaded secret police. Their intelligence service heavily infiltrated almost every aspect of those countries' political institutions and media. They insisted that their heavy-handed hegemonic role was to protect and defend these nations from the rival superpower and their agents. And any dissidents who challenged their government or Soviet domination were accused of being agents of the rival superpower and were jailed, tortured, or killed. The Soviets imposed their economic system on these Central and Eastern European nations and made them dependent on Soviet markets and Soviet goods. In a couple cases, when governments tried to create alternative systems based on a more democratic socialist model, the Soviets invaded and overthrew their governments, reinstalled compliant regimes. So why am I talking about the Soviets in Eastern Europe when the topic today is the United States and Latin America? Because everything I have just described also applies to US relations with Latin America for most of the 20th century. Let's take the example of the Dominican Republic. The United States sent in the Marines to conquer that country in 1916, did not withdraw until 1924. And for many years after that, the US effectively controlled the banks and customs houses. They broke up peasant communal landholdings and helped US sugar companies consolidate control over the economy. They formed an army led by a man they selected named Rafael Trujillo, who happened to be a former guard at a US sugar plantation. Trujillo seized power in 1930 and ruled for more than 3 decades. US support enabled him to consolidate one of the world's most ruthless dictatorships, responsible for tens of thousands of deaths. He and his family ended up controlling over half of the country's assets. In 1958, a revolution was gaining ground in nearby Cuba. And on New Year's Day, the dictatorship, another US-backed right-wing dictatorship under the leadership of Juan Bautista, was overthrown. And Fidel Castro came to power. That made the United States nervous, because here was a leftist regime, which within a couple of years would formally declare itself being communist. And the incoming presidency of John Kennedy started realizing that supporting these friendly dictators could end up backfiring. So the United States started pushing for reforms, started backing opposition leaders, got the message across to some army officers they'd like to see him overthrown. The CIA even drew up plans for Trujillo's assassination. Trujillo was assassinated in May of 1961, though it's unclear whether it was the CIA or it was part of an ongoing plot that would have happened anyway. Close relatives of Trujillo ended up holding on, but by November of that year, strikes and other largely nonviolent protests by the Dominicans led his family to flee, and military officers took over. Under US pressure, Juan Balaguer, a military officer who was one of Trujillo's top aides, ended up taking control. Again, a largely nonviolent resistance movement in 1962 forced Balaguer to step down. There were free democratic elections in December of 1962, the first such free democratic elections in that country's history. And Juan Bosch, a social democrat, became president in February of 1963, the first democratically elected leader of that country. And he began some serious reforms. He was concerned that so much of the land belonged to foreign sugar companies and both local elites and foreigners, and that caused some dissatisfaction both within the United States, but also among elites and powerful interests within the Dominican Republic. And in September 1963, there was a military coup. So this democratic period was very short-lived. There's no evidence the US was specifically behind the coup, But Washington, made it clear that they were willing to work with these new leaders. But there are some divisions within the military. There was a split between the far right and more reformist officers in 1965, led to these divisions empowered constitutionalist forces who led an insurrection, an armed insurrection, calling for a return to the democratic constitution of 2 years earlier. It was a broad coalition, included Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, some leftists, but this was clearly a democratic uprising. Despite this, under President Johnson, who had taken over in Washington following the assassination of Kennedy, the United States invaded the Dominican Republic with 30,000 Marines that May, ostensibly to save American lives and to, in the words of the Johnson administration, to prevent a communist takeover. 30,000 U.S. troops, that's more than we had in Vietnam at that time. And this is despite the fact that no American lives were lost prior to the invasion, and the opposition was virtually all Democrats. These were not communists. And I remember as a boy watching this on TV, and the U.S. media largely accepted the narrative of the Johnson administration that this was a communist uprising, and we were there to protect ourselves. This was an act of self-defense against this attempted communist takeover. And I remember being really shook up seeing these dead bodies in the streets of Santo Domingo, whom a crying father was yelling out that these are not guerrillas. They were his sons. They just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. They're unarmed. Indeed, thousands of Dominicans were killed by U.S. occupying troops. The U.S. reinstalled Balaguer, who reopened the country to welcome unrestricted U.S. foreign investment. Many thousands of Dominicans were jailed, tortured, and killed. And Balaguer then ruled for more than a quarter century, received large amounts of U.S. aid to keep him in power. And to create kind of a safety valve for a population that was poor, was struggling economically, the United States ended up allowing an unprecedented level of immigration from the Dominican Republic to the United States. In fact, next to Puerto Ricans and Mexicans, there are more Dominicans in this country than any Hispanic group, primarily concentrated in northeastern urban areas. Since the end of the dictatorship, the country has experienced free, competitive elections. Moderate left of center parties have won most of these elections. But due to the policies of the dictatorship, the country got in serious debt, and the International Monetary Fund, the international financial institution that wields a lot of power, has basically in return for restructuring these loans, has made it very difficult for these democratically elected governments to pursue economic policies that would benefit the majority of the population. Now, in many respects, the story of the United States and the Dominican Republic that I just outlined in very brief and admittedly superficial terms is in many ways the story of the United States and Latin America as a whole. If you look at a map like the one behind me, finding Guatemala In 1944, a nonviolent uprising overthrew the Obiko dictatorship in 1944. After 2 terms of a democratic elected government, Jacobo Arbenz was elected the president, but his left-leaning policies, support for trade unions, land reform, resulted in a CIA-backed coup, which overthrew him, brought in a right-wing military leader, and that country suffered under a brutal military dictatorship for the next 30 years. Close to 200,000 Guatemalans, out of a population of barely 5 million, died under the regime, and though democracy has been restored to the country, the gang violence and other consequences of those dark years of dictatorship and guerrilla warfare, have continued to lead to great suffering among the people of Guatemala. Brazil, in 1964, the reformist presidency of João Goulart was overthrown in a U.S.-backed military coup. The U.S. Navy was offshore, ready to intervene if it didn't go well. The coup did succeed. Again, Brazil found itself under dictatorial rule for the next 20 years. In 1973, Chile democratically elected President Salvador Allende, a democratic socialist who wanted to maintain democratic institutions and a primarily market economy, but to make some radical reforms to make sure the country's wealth really belonged to the Chilean people, which included nationalizing Kennecott Copper, which controlled an American company, which controlled the country's much of the country's mineral wealth, and IT&T, the U.S.-based telecommunications giant, which controlled the phone system and other communications. This led Henry Kissinger to say we will not allow a country to become communist because of the stupidity of its own people, acknowledging that that we did not respect democracy if it was seen to go the wrong way. Again, in the words of Kissinger, we would make the economy scream, by imposing very strict economic sanctions, supporting right-wing military officers, which staged a bloody coup in September of 1973, killing thousands and plunging that country into decades of brutal military dictatorship. I could talk about the U.S. invasion of Grenada in 1983, the U.S. invasion of Panama in 1989. One of the more tragic interventions was in El Salvador, when a brutal right-wing coalition government was met by both nonviolent and violent resistance in the late 1970s and into the 80s. Ended up sending out death squads, which killed tens of thousands of people, including American nuns, Jesuit priests, including the president, provost, and the leading faculty of La UCA, the University of Central America, the country's preeminent academic institution. Even the Catholic Archbishop, Oscar Romero, was gunned down saying Mass. Now, these church people clearly were not communists, but they were calling for an end to the repression. They were calling for social justice. And that was too much for the U.S.-backed government. The Reagan administration, in justifying this war, claimed that, it was a democratic government struggling for reforms, caught between the far left and the far right. But as many of us suspected at the time, and as empirical evidence subsequently has demonstrated from investigations by the United Nations and others that well over 90% of the civilian casualties were committed by government-backed forces that were armed and trained by the United States. And indeed, the United States has actively engaged in cover-ups of atrocities, by these governments, including claiming that the Jesuit murders were by the guerrillas, when 60 Minutes revealed that the U.S. Embassy, in fact, knew that the orders had come directly from the Minister of Defense. Nicaragua, another tragic case. A U.S.-backed dictator who'd been installed by U.S. Marines, and we occupied that country for nearly a quarter century. Earlier in the 1920s, 1930s. He was overthrown in a popular uprising in 1979, led by a broad coalition of Marxist, progressive church activists, other liberals and leftists, known as the Sandinistas. And they embarked on some ambitious reforms, not wanting to go the way of Cuba, in other words, allowing opposition, allowing a mixed economy, but nevertheless, wanting a revolutionary transformation in a society where the Somoza family had controlled over half the country's assets. The United States worked with the exiled members of the old dictatorship's private army, formed a group known as the Contras, which never got much support inside the country. They mostly engaged in cross-border raids from Honduras, where the United States set up bases and arms supplies, training, bankrolled them basically. It was the mercenary army. They primarily went after soft targets, that is, schools, healthcare clinics, other projects of the leftist Sandinista government. That the U.S. was concerned was making the government too popular. Indeed, the CIA had a manual that was leaked to the press, which encouraged these attacks on such soft targets. As the CIA director William Casey put it, it takes relatively few people and little support to disrupt the internal peace and economic stability of a small country. Some U.S. officials acknowledged privately there was human rights abuses, essentially acts of terrorism, by the Contras. One official acknowledging that, quote, Contras have a tendency to kidnap young girls. And Amnesty International and others found evidence of just horrific acts of terror. 42% of the victims were children. 8,000 children were orphaned. 200 teachers were killed, along with health workers, members of agricultural co-ops, even some foreign aid workers, including a young American I knew, Ben Lender, from Portland, Oregon. And yet, the Reagan administration and the supporters in Congress and the media kept referring to them as freedom fighters, as a moral equivalent of our founding fathers, as the democratic opposition, making parallels with anti-Nazi French resistance in World War II. The International Court of Justice, in a unanimous decision, say for the U.S. judge, declared these operations illegal, recognized them as terrorism, including the United States mining Nicaraguan harbors, damaging freighters of allied European countries, and bombing the country's oil supplies. The hope was that would wear down the Sandinistas, force them into countermeasures that would alienate the population. And it worked. The more hardline elements within the Sandinista coalition came to predominate, alienating many of their former supporters. How were these operations justified in El Salvador and in Nicaragua? Basically, the U.S. claim was we were doing this in self-defense. That it was Nicaragua and the Salvadoran guerrillas who were the aggressors. According to this narrative, these uprisings are not the initial Sandinista revolution overthrew Somoza, and the ongoing revolutions in El Salvador and Guatemala were not because of certain social conditions where half the children in rural areas died before the age of 5, and when only a handful of landowners controlled most of the agricultural resources, but because the Soviet Union had a hit list that the Soviet Union, using Cubans, was part of a plot. And according to the Reagan administration, the plot was first to take over Nicaragua, then El Salvador, then Guatemala, then Mexico, and they're going to work their way up the isthmus and then invade the United States. He pointed out that Harlingen, Texas, was closer to Managua, Nicaragua, than it was to Washington, D.C. And those in the academic community, I mean, just the overwhelming majority of Latin American scholars challenged this narrative. Yet they were attacked as communists, as pro-Soviet, as moles, for the KGB, much in the way that Middle East scholars have been attacked in more recent years for questioning questioning the invasion of Iraq, or U.S. support for the Israeli occupation, coming up with some inconvenient analysis that did not fit in with the official narrative. When Amnesty International, the UN, the Red Cross, other human rights groups documented atrocities by groups allied to the United States, they were also attacked as being biased, much in the way these same groups have been attacked, for example, for raising concerns about the actions of the U.S. allies in the Middle East, like Israel, Morocco, Iraq, and others. Polls showed that three justifications the United States gave for intervention in Central America during the 1980s. Indeed, we've heard this narrative throughout the 20th century in dealing with our relations with Latin America as a whole, has been that these governments are communist, which is a term used broadly, included democratic socialist governments as well. The governments are communist, that they violate human rights, and that they're a threat to our security. American public, however, said that, well, if they want to be socialist or even communist, that's may not be what kind of government I would choose, but it's their choice. If they violate human rights, that's not good. And if we can do anything to help the situation, that's okay. But a lot of our allies violate human rights too. So again, that's not really a reason for intervention. The only reason most Americans would support intervention was that if these countries were threats. And so if you look at the language that's been used, whether it be Dominican Republic or Chile or Nicaragua or El Salvador or anywhere else, it's almost always been along the lines that these countries are threats. These kind of interventions are in self-defense against communism. Well, how then how are we able to justify intervention prior to communism? Remember the Russian Revolution, which brought communism, which turned the Russian Empire into the Soviet Union, took place in 1917. Remember I mentioned we invaded Dominican Republic in 1916, in Haiti in 1912, and we had a number of interventions in the Caribbean Basin, Central America prior to that. Well, if you look at the justifications of the administrations at that time, from Taft, from Wilson, and others, we were doing it to fight the Germans. The Germans were behind these governments we had to invade. And I couldn't help but notice in the Republican Party platform, they're accusing Venezuela, under a left-wing nationalist government, of offering safe havens to thousands of Middle Eastern terrorists. The head of the Republican head of the House Foreign Relations Committee just recently hosted hearings which insisted that Ecuador, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba were working with Iran to establish and reinforce networks of terrorist cells and training camps connected to Hezbollah, the radical Lebanese Shia group, and that Iran has established these Hezbollah-manned training camps in Venezuela to train Venezuelans to attack American targets. They even claim that Venezuela hosts Iranian missiles from which Iran could reach American territory. Indeed, and again, you repeatedly hear the Republican leaders claim that Venezuela has become an Iranian outpost. Now, absolutely no hard evidence has been produced to validate any of these claims. But you can see how it fits a certain pattern. Just as the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 against the democratic socialist government of Alexander Dubček, who said, yes, we want socialism, but we want socialism with a human face, not a totalitarian Soviet-style regime. He was invaded because he was saying that it was going to be a base for NATO and for Western imperialism. Similar, the brutal invasion of Hungary in 1956, the suppression of the Solidarność free trade union movement in Poland. I should mention that it's not just the Republicans that engage in some of this rhetoric. Hillary Clinton, the front runner for the Democratic nomination, has argued that the U.S. needs to take a more aggressive stance against the rise of left-leaning governments in the hemisphere, arguing that electing these developments would be, quote, at our peril. And in response to the election of a number of left-leaning governments, which are challenging structural obstacles which have left many of their nations in poverty, she's expressed alarm that, quote, we have witnessed the rollback of democratic development and economic openness in parts of Latin America, and that the United States must, quote, return to a policy of vigorous engagement. Latin Americans kind of remember back in the era where we had vigorous engagement in the territory, and are thus, as you might imagine, concerned. Indeed, there was a coup in Guatemala 4 years ago. There's no evidence that the United States was behind it, but it did oust a democratically elected left-leaning government under President Zelaya. And Clinton, in her autobiography that just came out, admitted that she used the power of her office to strategize on a plan for the junta to restore order in Honduras and prevent Zelaya, from coming to office. Now, throughout this period, if you kind of deconstruct the language we have used regarding Latin America, we hear terms like our backyard. And when you step back and think about that, what does that imply? It implies ownership, right? And also, who lives in your backyard? Animals you don't allow in the house, for example. There is that, and I remember looking at a series of political cartoons from the 20s, 30s through the 1980s, where and all involved U.S. intervention in Central America. And in each of these cartoons, by different cartoonists in very different eras, the United States is depicted by Uncle Sam, this kind of exasperated uncle, and the Central American countries with the names, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, were these little bratty children that the United States had to control. But what's one of the big developments that we've seen in recent years, despite Clinton's call for more vigorous engagement, despite some of the paranoid Republican fantasies of Iranian influence, is that the United States just does not exercise the kind of control we live in. We live in a much more pluralistic country, a pluralistic world now. That there is more South-South trade. between Latin American countries, between Latin America and China, with India, South Africa, and elsewhere. The popular movements are not just these armed Marxist vanguard revolutionaries, but popular social movements, trade unions, peasant leagues, women's groups, human rights organizations, the Progressive Church. It was largely nonviolent movements that brought down the dictatorships in Chile, in Bolivia, in Brazil, in Argentina, and elsewhere. Much as it was the Polish dock workers, Czech intellectuals, East German church people, Estonian folk singers, and millions of other ordinary Eastern Europeans that brought down Soviet control of Eastern Europe back in the late 1980s. So, in other words, and I think Obama, though I do certainly have some disagreements with his foreign policies in a number of areas, to his credit, like Mikhail Gorbachev, when he was in charge of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev was the last Soviet leader, realizes there are limits to power. It is no longer this rigid bipolar world where any great power can control its so-called backyard. It's that ordinary people are the ones who are taking charge. Now, it's not surprising that having experienced the Soviet version of socialism, that is this totalitarian communist kind of rule, that a free Eastern Europe has generally been voting for moderately conservative right-of-center governments. And similar, given what their experience has been of U.S.-style capitalism, that in recent years, most Latin American countries have been electing, more left-leaning, democratic governments. But and again, one can question, depending on your own political orientation, about the choices that some of these governments have made. In Nicaragua, for example, a faction of the Sandinistas that has ended up imposing a new kind of authoritarianism, ironically in alliance with some right-wing elements, alienating much of the original base of the Sandinistas. And there are some legitimate concerns about, on human rights grounds, of a number of Latin American countries, though, again, not to the extent that we had during the Cold War, when you had the massacres and death squads and that kind of thing. But I think it underscores that, we live in an era where the United States cannot control things in Latin America, like we used to, any more than the Russians can control events in Eastern Europe. That the people of the region are the ones who are ultimately, for good or for ill, in charge of their fate. What's also positive, I think, is that more and more of us here in the United States are learning Spanish, are traveling to Latin America. That your generation is the first generation of Americans who's more likely to have traveled in Latin America than has traveled in Europe. That there are people-to-people exchanges through social media that you don't have to fall into some of the paternalistic and often racist stereotypes that were used to justify intervention in the past. So I want to conclude with just throw out three questions. I was asked to think of some questions for you all to bring back to your groups. And that's the following. What has led the U.S. government, despite its professed support for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, to pursue policies in Latin America and elsewhere in the world that are contrary to these principles? Another question is, given that the American public overwhelmingly supports such principles, how has the United States gotten away with such policies? And finally, is the anti-Americanism we find in Latin America, in other parts of the world like the Middle East, is because, as our political leaders have sometimes said, they hate our freedom and oppose our values? Or is it because we have strayed from those values and have not consistently supported freedom? Looks like I have another 8 to 10 minutes, and I would be happy to open things up to any questions that people have. Thank you. Yes. Well, it's interesting. I actually, when I was a grad student working my dissertation, I was looking at the one of my case studies was U.S. overthrow of the Arbenz government in Guatemala, and sort of as well as U.S. overthrow of the Mossadegh government in Iran. And the left-wing narrative has always been, oh, we did it for United Fruit Company, and had close ties to the Eisenhower administration. We did Iran, of course, for the oil. But actually going over these documents, the archives, the communications between the Dulles brothers and the ambassadors and Ike and everyone, what really struck me is these guys actually believed their own rhetoric. They really thought the commies were taking over. I mean, in hindsight, this was an exaggerated fear, but remember, this was the 1950s, McCarthyism, there was a communist under every bed, and there's that kind of view that, I mean, one can certainly argue that, the fact that U.S. intervention often parallels economic interests of powerful corporations and others is not coincidental. But, and that often powerful corporate interests play a role in convincing policymakers to accept a particular narrative that would, lead to intervention. And there are no doubt individuals within any particular administrations that might be motivated by crass economic interest. But the older I get, the more I study U.S. foreign policy, the less I'm inclined to be an economic determinist and see things in a more conspiratorial way, but also just to see the power of ideology, of self-deception. I remember there's a story of Oliver North getting real excited, running and said, hey, we have proof that the Cubans are all over Nicaragua. And these Soviet agents, they're taking all over Nicaragua. And says, what's the proof? Look at all these baseball diamonds we see on the satellite of photos. Nicaraguans play soccer, not baseball. That's baloney. Nicaraguans are crazy about baseball. There are 3 Nicaraguans in the major leagues at that time. But again, they really wanted to believe it. And it's interesting how you've had these popular nonviolent uprisings in recent years in Serbia, Georgia, Ukraine, and other pro-democracy struggles, Iran, Burma, Zimbabwe, and the line you get from these defenders of the autocratic regimes, as well as some self-described anti-imperialists here in the United States, is, oh, these are U.S. plots. The U.S. has a hit list. These are soft coups. We put those students, the students in Serbia up to this, by giving them all this money. Yeah, Otpor, the pro-democracy movement in Serbia, some of these others have gotten small contributions from the National Endowment for Democracy. That doesn't cause a revolution any more than a small amount of Soviet or Cuban aid caused these revolutions in Latin America. So there's a tendency, I think, across the political spectrum to deny agency. To not, and in fact, it's kind of a racist mentality. It's like, it's kind of this idea that these Latin Americans or these Eastern Europeans or these Africans or Asians, whatever, they can't do it themselves. It has to be a superpower, white people, whether it be Russians or Americans, who put them up to it and who cause this kind of thing to happen. So I think, and so again, don't want to underestimate the power of crass economic motivations, but I think there is this kind of ideological bias, this kind of state-centric bias that denies agency and tends to make people really believe their own rhetoric about the somehow this other being responsible, for challenges to allied dictators. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, well, briefly, leftist is the term used for people who have a somewhat more socialist, oriented, a belief. The idea that the state has a certain responsibility, to push wealth downward, redistribute wealth, provide for the general welfare, and would intend to be more hostile to foreign corporate interests. Um, and where leftists, of course, could just like like many of the ideologies, you have a more authoritarian, even totalitarian version that we have from communism, but also you have more people of a more democratic socialist vision that believe that economic democracy and political democracy go hand in hand. And on the right, you have those who are who tend to be more towards the interest of traditional elites, whether they be the landed aristocracy, the military, wealthy capitalists. In the case of Latin America, they'd be more likely to ally with the United States. And again, people on the right, like many American conservatives, may can still believe in democracy. And believe that minimizing government role in the economy is part of liberty, just like individual liberty is. But you also have people on the right, like many of these regimes in Latin America, that were authoritarian, that were dictatorial, that not only were willing to deny their people basic social and economic rights, but were willing to deny them their political and civil rights as well. I think there's I think always been something of a conflict between the democratic values around our country was founded with. We were the first country to incorporate the ideals of the Enlightenment in our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. That was pretty darn radical in the late 18th century. I mean, we were really in the forefront. We were the most progressive country in the world at that time. And yet, at the same time, look what we were doing to the indigenous peoples of this country. Look at the slavery in the South. And we've also, so there's always been this kind of contradiction. I think that's what we're sort of seeing, that there's the imperatives of empire, of manifest destiny, this idea that in many ways, because we have these best values, that gives us license to do certain things. There's also, as President Eisenhower, who happened to be a Republican and a general, warned us, there's this military-industrial complex that for both bureaucratic and economic self-interest, there's a reason to spend so much money in the military. We're spending more in the military now than the Cold War. 55% of Obama's discretionary budget that he brought to Congress last week, 55% goes to the military. And the Republicans say, no, that's not enough of the military. We need more of the military, even less for needs at home. And so there's that drive as well. And whether the threat be the alleged threat be the Germans, the Soviets, or the terrorists, there will be a tendency, and we've seen this in many other countries, many other governments as well, to frighten people into supporting a kind of foreign policy which kind of reinforces certain elite interests that either consciously or unconsciously help maintain the system. And my hope, and I may also finish there since this is time now, I think the big hope is I think your generation, on the one hand, your generation is less ideological than previous generations on the left-right issue. But I think on the other hand, there is a greater skepticism, a healthy skepticism of of official rationales, particularly when it does come to foreign policy, foreign wars, foreign intervention. And you find this both among people on the left liberal end of the spectrum, but also more people more libertarian end of the spectrum as well. And so I just encourage you to take advantage of the greater access you have to alternative perspectives through the internet and elsewhere, and through professors who may be specialists in these areas to learn, and not just take for granted what a particular administration says, whether it be Democrat or Republican. Thank you.